Was at first a disturbing story about political servitude violating the sanctity of the offices of federal prosecutors. Then it was a story about employees in those offices being hired only if they were political adherents, something that rang of the old Soviet Politburo. But in our fourth story on the countdown tonight, the Alberto Gonzales U.S. attorney firing scandal has now reshaped itself again, like some governmental Andromeda strain, into what looks like an attempt to deprive Democrats of the right to vote. Meet Bradley Schlossman. The McClatchy newspaper is reporting that Mr. Schlossman, a senior official at the Department of Justice, is now sharing the spotlight of the White House liaison Monica Goodling as the focus of congressional investigators pursuing accusations that both of them illegally used political party as hiring criteria. What takes this beyond the U.S. attorneys is that now Congress is looking at allegations that virtually every level of employment at Justice was subject to a political litmus test. This went right down to the interns. Furthermore, Schlossman's involvement means the scandal now revolves around your fundamental right to vote, because the office Schlossman is accused of turning into a political arm of the Republican Party is the Justice Department's voting rights section. Two former attorneys telling the McClatchy chain that Schlossman hired them after seeing Republican credentials on their resumes and then told them to resubmit those resumes without including their telltale Republican Party ties. Schlossman and his staff aggressively targeted voter fraud, but did so by pushing laws and policies widely seen as depressing the votes of minorities and the poor, like the Georgia law that required the use of $20 photo IDs, Tom DeLay's Texas redistricting that favored Republicans there, and of course the push to sweep voters off the rolls in Missouri, all struck down by various courts. While at the same time, Schlossman, head of the voting rights section, reportedly prosecuted not a single case defending a black person's right to vote. According to Schlossman's predecessor, Joe Rich, U.S. attorneys were told instead to give priority to voter fraud cases, which indicated an intent to depress voter turnout in minority and poor communities. The career voting rights attorneys, veterans of administrations of both parties, so disheartened that more than half of them left or quit the section in just the last 2 years. Let's turn now to Rachel Maddow, who tracks the emerging details every weeknight on Air America Radio. Thanks again for your time, Rachel.
Hi, Keith. Nice to see you.
This must be a full-time job. Let's cut to the chase here. When Karl Rove spoke about wanting to create the permanent Republican majority, is this what he was talking about? Install prosecutors who only pursue voting fraud cases in which the alleged perps are Democrats?
The Civil Rights Division, the voting rights section in the Civil Rights Division, it's not supposed to be one of the teams in the partisan warfare in Washington. It's supposed to be the ump. This is supposed to be the group that's making sure that nobody's cheating, that nobody's throwing spitballs. To have made this a partisan thing, to have had a political litmus test for people to be employed in this division or in this section, but also to use the power of that division to drive things in a Republican division, in a Republican direction, it's constitutionally obscene. At the other side of it, though, is that it shows that the Republicans may not believe they can win on a level playing field. It shows that they may not think they can win if nobody's cheating, if they feel like they need to bribe the ump this way.
Yeah, but you could even take it a little more broadly than that, couldn't you, and suggest that the goal of the Republican Party is to eliminate the two-party system, or have the other one be the Washington Nationals to its Harlem Globetrotters?
Well, there's something to be said for the fact that they have decided to take the machinery of the federal government, turn it into an arm of the Republican Party. I mean, the way that the division works and the way that the Civil Rights Division works and the Voting Rights Division works is it's part of the 1957 Civil Rights Act. This is something that's supposed to make sure that everybody has access to our democracy. This is something that's supposed to make sure that people who have been historically kept out of the voting booth are not discriminated against and are brought in. The fact that the Justice Department right now in its Civil Rights Division has 2 African-American attorneys out of 50 on staff, which is the same number of African-American attorneys they had in 1978 when I was 5. Meanwhile, their staff has doubled in size, shows that they're not taking their civil rights obligations seriously.
As to this Mr. Schlossman, who comes in with a nickname or a name that sounds like it's created by some fiction writer, he was a U.S. attorney in Missouri briefly, and during his brief stay there, got to indict 4 people on voting fraud charges. I know you've been following that part of this. Give us the particulars of that story.
As I understand it, the previous U.S. attorney for for Kansas City, Missouri. One of the reasons that they may have had a target on him from the Justice Department, from the Bush administration, possibly from the White House, is because he had not shown sufficient willingness to bring anti-Democrat cases in Missouri, cases that might help the Republicans' election chances. So he was pushed out. Bradley Schlossman was installed in his place. Schlossman, who had no prosecutorial experience and, because of the Patriot Act, didn't require Senate confirmation. As soon as he got there, literally 5 days before the election in November 2006, he brought indictments against 4 people who worked as $8 an hour voter registration workers for a progressive group. 5 days before the election. And the Republican Party, predictably, then used those indictments to beat up on the Democrats right up until Election Day. Schlossman also announced that on Election Day, he would have a prosecutor ready to go on call in case there was any voter fraud anywhere that needed to be prosecuted, creating an environment of hysteria, fear, and voter suppression among people who might potentially want to vote Democratic.
If, as you have posited here, the agency supposed to defend voting rights has been turned into a means of keeping one side's voting rights intact and depressing the other ones, how do you undo that? How do you undo just that part of the process, let alone whatever ultimate damage has been done to the basic notion of equal rights for voting in this country?
Well, it's very serious. It goes to the core of how we function as a democracy. And I think 2 things need to happen. Number one, whoever we pick as president next has to decide not to just keep all of this expanded partisan executive power that the Bush and Cheney administration has created. They need to decide to do what's right for the country and not just what's right for themselves and their party. But secondly, we need to make sure that people are held accountable for what they've done here. We need to make sure that there are people who are impeached if they need to be impeached, people who are brought up on charges if they need to be brought up on charges. The wrongs committed here need to be answered to so this doesn't happen again.